Good morning, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Nigel Russell, and I'm the founder and organizer of the Precision Medicine Leaders Summits and the Journal of Precision Medicine. We have a great lineup of presentations for you over the next 2 days and hope you will find the discussions informative and thought-provoking. I would like to extend my gratitude to the numerous people involved in putting this event together. Hannah Mamushka, the CEO and founder of Alva 10, has been instrumental in putting the agenda together. Thank you very much, Hannah. I'd also like to thank our speakers for making themselves available to share their insights into the precision diagnostics arena and the precision medicine ecosystem in general. I know your time is precious, so thank you. 2020 has definitely thrown some curveballs to us all, and especially conference organizers. We're extremely grateful to our partners and sponsors for their continued support and enabling us to keep the important discussion around precision medicine top of mind. Thank you. I know most of us have been attending virtual meetings and events over the past several months and may consider it old hat. I would like to point out a few items which will make the day go smoothly and for everyone to get the most out of the day's proceedings. After each presentation, there will be a live Q&A session. Please make sure to pose your questions using the mobile app during the presentation, and we will get to as many of these questions as possible. To make sure you're able to hear the speakers' responses, please ensure that you are logged in to the Q&A session after the main presentation. Thank you again for joining us, and please be sure to register for our other virtual events this fall. And now over to you, Hannah, for our first panel.
Thank you all for joining us at the Precision Diagnostic Conference. My name is Hannah Mamushka, and I am the CEO and founder of Alva 10. Today on this panel, we are going to discuss the challenges and opportunities with diagnostics in the era of COVID. This pandemic has brought to light the challenges of the diagnostic industry like almost nothing else could. How difficult it is to determine the clinical utility of a test, who should be paying for a test and when, what a test needs to look like, who should get a test first, and how to distribute a test in an environment where not everyone is able to get access to the healthcare system. And the reality is, we're not near the end of this pandemic. Even if the vaccines come out this winter, it's going to be a long time before the majority of the US population is able to be vaccinated. And so we're going to have ways of assessing both the transmission of the virus, the susceptibility of the virus, the risk of the virus as we move into 2021. I'm joined on this panel today by a fantastic group of experts with a really diverse experience when it comes to thinking about, working in, and planning for the pandemic around COVID-19. And this includes Parker Cassidy from RA Capital, Christiana Ayashera from MGH, Eugene Shimenwal from Independence Blue Cross, Mark Hyatt from Garden Health, and Andy Reamer from SidePorch. I'm going to ask my co-panelists to introduce themselves briefly, and then we will get started with our discussion. Can I start with you, Parker?
Great, thank you, Anna. I'm Parker Cassidy, and I have spent my career, the majority of my career in diagnostics, developing and launching new products, and most recently jumping over to the investment side and looking for investment opportunities within the space. And one of the things that we've done over the course of this pandemic is to really map out the landscape of all of the diagnostic tests and therapeutics that are in development for COVID. So we've spent quite a bit of time understanding this question. I'm excited to engage with the rest of the panel.
Thanks, Parker. Eugene?
So Eugene Juvenmal, thank you for having me. I'm glad to be part of this brilliant panel. Work at Independence Blue Cross in the Medical Policy and Technology Evaluation Department as a senior research analyst, responsible for evidence reviews and especially responsible for the whole lab pathology space and policy positions for all the testing that has been around for the past decade and a half I've been involved with. So naturally, when COVID-19, unfortunately, was a topic that we had to handle, I have been heavily involved in all aspects of it, and especially testing. So hopefully we can have a useful conversation and productive for folks who are viewing this.
Great, thanks, Eugene. Mark?
Hello, pleased to be part of this panel. Like Eugene, I have some background in health plans. I used to be the medical director, the executive medical director for a multi-state Blue Cross Blue Shield plan. But now I'm a leader for a precision oncology company called Guardant Health, which is a pioneer in cancer diagnostics. So this is kind of interesting thing in talking about COVID-19, but we saw the need to enter the realm of diagnosing also for infection, given this crisis. And I do this on my clinical background as a diagnostic radiologist, and really looking forward to this discussion.
Thanks, Mark. Christiana?
So I'm Christiana Iyashira. I'm a physician by training. I work at Mass General Hospital. I'm also the director of the innovation program there, where we make investments in early stage promising ideas coming out of the department, and have made a series of investments in early stage diagnostics. I know Hannah quite well because I was a previous co-founder of an early stage diagnostics biotech. And then particularly relevant to this panel conversation, I also have spent a significant amount of clinical time over the past 6 months taking care of patients with COVID-19, and I've been able to see the arc and transformation of care from the very early stages of figuring out the chaos and confusion of how to diagnose patients to the now more nuanced treatment options that we have as the pandemic evolves.
Thanks, Christiana. And Andy.
Thanks, Hannah, and very grateful to be here. My name's Andy Reamer, pronouns today he, him, his. My background is in scaling impact at companies and nonprofits across various different sectors through equity and inclusion. And I'm currently at SidePorch, who is a strategy consulting firm that partners with leaders taking on humanity's biggest challenges and opportunities and develop values-driven strategy and partnerships to scale measurable impact. In the COVID era, we've been working with a variety of different organizations, including municipalities and private companies, to support their COVID responses. And we've also been working to support organizations that have developed their own COVID responses, including those that have developed diagnostic testing. Pleasure to be here and really looking forward to this conversation.
Thanks, Andy. Okay, well, first I'd like to start out with the clinical questions. Christiana, as you said, you've been treating COVID patients for the past 6 months. How has that treatment evolved, and how do you feel that things are, different juxtaposed between March and September?
So I've said this a couple of times to various parties. It's been one of the most interesting times in my career as a physician, I have to say, to encounter a completely new and novel diagnostic entity. I've been doing this job long enough that that's a pretty rare event. And when we first started in early February and March, in general, I would say our approach was really one of sort of chaos and confusion. I think it's just the reality if we're going to be get down to brass tacks. At that point in time, we had a sense of what was happening in Wuhan, but I think that there was a false security that it was not going to affect us. And we started to see patients sort of trickle in with disease presentations that we hadn't exactly been comfortable with or aware of in the past. And I actually remember chatting with my team, actually pulling diagnostic sort of algorithms from the Wuhan published literature to kind of get a sense of how we should think about and triage patients. Similarly, at that time, it was very, very difficult to get diagnostic testing. So we were sort of following the algorithms that were coming out from both the CDC and then our local sort of health departments. And generally at that time, again, we're talking February, March, you had to have either directly been in Wuhan or an associated province, or have a direct sort of contact with someone there who was known to be sick to even get testing. So in that sense, we would see patients who had a logical story that could be consistent with what we knew of COVID-19 at that time, but had a very difficult time testing them. And so as you can imagine, when it comes to like the patient perspective, how do we care for that individual? That's very challenging. And then you have the larger public health concerns of, am I being exposed and now exposing others, including other members of my healthcare team, my family, people that I know, potentially being a COVID-19 carrier. I would juxtapose that with what we see now. So currently in my practice, every single patient that comes into the hospital is COVID-19 tested. So when I walk into a patient's room, I know whether or not they have COVID-19 or not. And in general, the patients that I care for, tend to be relatively sick with the disease if they're COVID-19 positive. In February and March, and then subsequently in April and May, basically our entire hospital was COVID-19. The last time I was on service most recently, I had 1 to 2 patients in the hospital on my service that I was caring for with COVID. And again, to juxtapose that with my experience, let's say in May, I took care of a cohort of a large number of patients, many of whom were doing, relatively unwell and subsequently transitioned to the ICU. We had a really difficult time understanding which of those would do particularly poorly because of specific nuances of the disease that we can talk about. And the disease way that we thought about treating it was constantly evolving. I would literally get pages hourly, like, do this. No, do this. No, now this is changing. Whereas now I took care of one patient 2 weeks ago, knew his COVID status immediately, had a very refined diagnostic algorithm. And it was funny, when the team presented to me his chest x-ray, I actually said to them, this must be the wrong patient, because the image was so impressively bad. He looked like somebody who should have been in the ICU, but he wasn't. And I'm pretty convinced he wasn't, because of the early use of steroids, the early use of adjunctive remdesivir kind of completely transformed his natural clinical arc. And I even said this to the patient, because he was like, I feel fine, why can't I be here? And I pulled up his chest film to say, this is your film, my friend. And if I had taken care of you in March, I'm pretty confident that you would be in the ICU and we wouldn't be having this conversation. So summatively, we've really seen a transformation in both the diagnosis of the disease, having a better sense of the clinical presentations, what that clinical arc will be, and then actually the interventions and therapies which are beneficial and can change the nature of the overall patient presentation.
That's amazing. And also, I don't think I ever said this, but thank you for all the work, especially in March and April and May and June when it was really bad. We're in Massachusetts and things are better now, but what was going on back then was really horrific and scary. From a diagnostic perspective, if you're managing a patient today, is there additional diagnostic information that you would say that you wish that you had, as far as predisposition to risk, or, anything in that direction that would further inform how you treat these patients?
So I think this gets back to the concept that we still are really treating a novel clinical entity. And so, really our knowledge base in terms of how this disease presents is changing day to day. So when we were back in, March, it was really sort of just, even observationally impressive to see that almost universally all the patients on my service that tended to do unwell almost all had a BMI greater than 35 and generally were men, right? So those aren't necessarily two things that you would say a priori would predict increased, risk of doing poorly. The other real challenge with COVID, I would say, comparatively to other infections that we think about in the same vein, like let's say take example of the flu. In COVID, actually, patients can kind of do okay for, let's say, anywhere from the first 5 to 7 days. And then there tends to be a cliff that people hit around day 7 where they start to do particularly poorly. And predicting who is going to hit that cliff and going to need advanced respiratory support can be actually relatively difficult. And so you can imagine from a clinical perspective, I'm seeing patients day 4 who look perfectly fine and quite frankly, really could leave the hospital and are asking me, why can't I leave? But I'm saying to them, at the same point in time, your inflammatory markers are going up, and I'm worried that in 3 days, you're going to struggle. So from a one-on-one sort of, I'm taking care of a patient, sort of what should I do? That becomes a very difficult question. And then as you think about it from a hospital or systems-based perspective, that's also very challenging, right? Because we have a cohort of patients who don't necessarily need to be in the hospital, but predicting whether or not they're going to do poorly is particularly challenging, and they're taking up beds which are incredibly valuable. Similarly, as you think about planning for ICU beds, which tends to be the largest bottleneck in caring for patients with this clinical entity, again, having a sense of where people are going to go, because expanding and contracting that resource is really challenging. The last thing I would say is if you think about how this compares to the flu in general, people's risk factors are sort of more well established. And again, if people tend to do poorly, it's a progressive decline. It's not where people are kind of doing okay. And then all of a sudden, day 7, oh my God, I can't breathe. And then later in the day, you're intubated in the ICU. So again, our knowledge base around the clinical entity continues to evolve. But if we had diagnostics that both help us plan on the one-to-one physician to patient perspective of, are you going to do poorly? And if so, how should I think about both triaging your care and caring for you therapeutically? And then on the larger hospital-based system level or healthcare system level, what are the cohorts of patients that are going to do poorly? So how do we plan and triage around hospital beds, ICU beds, and things like that that are very resource intensive and difficult to expand and contract on demand?
Sure. That, and to me, that's really a question to you, Eugene, because, the development of these diagnostics, there are a variety of consortium. RA Capital has put together this amazing COVID Tech Atlas, which has a whole variety of either programs, consortium, data, where there is data being developed that can, think about addressing these questions, but the biggest challenge is who's going to pay for it. And if you juxtapose the cost that Christiana just described around how expensive it is to keep someone in the hospital because you're not sure if they're going to end up in the ICU, but you don't want to risk sending them home, it seems like that's really an opportunity for that diagnostic to get developed, to be able to confidently assess that risk and make that decision. But from a payer perspective, how do you think about that? And how do you think about it in the context of a pandemic where we don't really have, hopefully, 18 months to 3 years to go through the normal coverage process for a novel diagnostic?
Right. So again, great points and raised, and also how to go about it. So I think in order to look to the future of how we can look towards coming up with that prognostic and sort of advanced diagnostics to answer these particular questions, let's just look at how we have done in the past, I would say around six or so months, and how we have dealt with this. So obviously, the thresholds, the evidence thresholds that we will be requiring, the protocols that are put in place for assessment purposes or in order to come up with policy positions are going to differ. Obviously, we're dealing with an epidemic, and we have to change the processes that we put in place. So obviously there were several questions when the diagnostics came about in the beginning. There were academic centers, they wanted to do it right away, but they were worried about the regulatory approvals that would be put in place and the delays that were there, the delays from the CDC in the initial stages. There were huge barriers, and there were let's just say there were tremendous problems that needed to be dealt with. Some of those have died down over time for especially folks like me, where we had to worry about the actual technical performance of these tests, because you cannot remove that from the situation completely in order to see what would be covered, what is actually clinically useful or not. So in the initial stages of this testing, we had to lean towards something. We couldn't say, oh, absolutely no testing would be covered, because obviously the situation that we're dealing with. At that time, if you recall, and the audience would recall, back in March and April, there was a lot of back and forth regarding FDA's involvement and how are they going about, assessing these tests and granting those emergency use authorizations. And if you dive down deeply into it, back then, there were a lot of parameters that evolved over time. The NPA, the PPA values, the technical sensitivity and specificity that was required, especially when the antibody testing started coming about. What was the sort of bare minimum thresholds when it came to the technical performance of these tests, be it RT-PCR antigen or antibody that must be achieved in order for them to get the emergency use authorization. So from a payer perspective, from a reimbursement perspective, yes, we're dealing with the public health emergency, but that is our go-to resource. In addition to obviously NIH and CDC and other guidelines that are out there, because we have to realize like evidence is evolving and the guidelines are continuously changing too. But one constant was those standards that have been there for the tests that were getting the EUAs. To answer that part of your question, Hannah, that yes, we don't have that much time. The points that have been brought up that, in order to basically a risk assessment test where you would know the prognosis based on a number of biological factors and markers that I'm sure are going to be going to be coming to the market soon. So yes, I don't believe that in this particular space, because of what we're dealing with, that timeline is applicable. That's why I use the examples of how we have handled the diagnostic RT-PCR antigen and then antibody testing and the standards that have been sort of, I wouldn't use the word required, but something that we can turn towards in order to see, okay, so there's multiple hundreds of tests that are out there. However, these are the ones that coverage will be provided for because they have gone through the necessary rigor in addition to the internal validation that an entity such as FDA has the standards that they have established, they're meeting those. Now, obviously, if we get time, we can talk about how the recent Human Health Services announcement regarding laboratory developed tests not requiring EUAs impacts that, and how that would have an impact indirectly or directly, depending on how you look at it, on somebody like me who's assessing these tests to see if they're ready for prime time. So that sort of gives us hope that the usual timelines that have been in place would not be there, but I would still state that a regulatory approval or involvement of an entity or bodies that are actually looking at the data in order to see that there is true clinical validity and utility to a certain extent, not the highest extent that we would ask in normal circumstances, is still there, would be absolutely necessary because it would, the patient, the direct patient impact and management would be dependent on this. How long would you keep the patient in the hospital? What sort of therapies down the line could be used for them? And at the same time, we have to also remember in the parallel world, we're also learning about the immunity, how long it will be there, is it sustainable or not? And then, so all those ties and connections have to be made. And so I wouldn't say that, it would be just because somebody has manufactured it that it would be ready for prime time. We will still need some sort of data. I wouldn't say the standards would be lowered in their evaluation, but the partnerships with, as I've explained in the past, as FDA has been involved, and yes, there's some nuances we have to work out there because of the HHS order, but that has to be in place in order for it to be disseminated and covered quickly, the future of testing.
Well, I mean, you could see a hospital system like Partners, and with the data that they have, with the number of patients that they have, you could see that the clinical lab being able to bring up an LDT, particularly with HHS's guidance around the use of LDTs, and the fact that this wouldn't really be a diagnostic for diagnosis, it would really be a prognostic test to assess for risk. And so that that wouldn't go through FDA from that perspective, but you could see it being certified on a local level. I think the question is, who's going to pay for that? The hospitals are generally not going to absorb it, although they may develop it. But from a financial perspective, it would certainly seem like it would behoove the insurance companies to assess that and figure out what data would be required to cover it.
Right. So let me make a quick comment on that. So in order to, so by no means I'm trying to shy away from stating this, but as we know, this is a continuously evolving situation. Mm-hmm. So you can say that I took the safe route in my previous response where I was like, oh, all right, but I like how you brought up the point about, and the distinction that I try to make as well of making it into a prognostic and it falling sort of outside of jurisdiction, but God knows who has jurisdiction over what these days, right? So, but we still have to turn towards. So this is, let's imagine this world, right? And it's a difficult world to imagine because if we do one thing for one academic center, or if we do one thing for one manufacturer or lab, it has to be there. The problem that an assessor or an evaluator has to deal with is we have to put everybody at the same standards. Everybody wants to collaborate with us. So let's just say that Mass General develops an in-house test, right? And they have great data. They tell to us, well, Eugene, I can give you the validation data, internal validation data, take a look at it, it's terrific. But if I do that for them, I have to do the same thing for UPenn. And so we need a repository, we need some sort of a data center that where all of these could be submitted and actually vetted. I think all of us could agree that yes, there are certain institutions where I wouldn't say you can take their word for it, but they hold certain respect and integrity levels where a productive partnership and collaboration during assessment can occur. But as we also know that is not the only 6 of us that is talking about this or is going to be in the business of moving ahead now that the RT-PCR antigen and antibody world is sort of like, I would say, getting close to being saturated. So these are the next steps. So we can't take data or evaluation out of it. I hope there is some involvement by institutions such as a branch of the NIH, which looks at it and, you know, sets certain parameters. And to be honest, like, you know, is it that I'm going to sit here and say, well, give me a peer-reviewed literature regarding your test? Well, it would depend on the situation and actual purpose for that test. So if it's an unmet clinical need, we can you know, talk further with that group. But you cannot exclude having some sort of data that has been reviewed by your peers and certain entities that have the knowledge about it and can make those connections between, let's say, if you're trying to do it to choose a particular therapeutic, those cannot be absent. So that's,
sure, absolutely. The data has to guide the way, for sure. Parker, when you think about the data atlas that you guys have put together, how are you thinking, if you are, about the diagnostic landscape and how investors are going to take advantage of this opportunity? And I say that because, you know, I talk to payers all day long. This is what I do. And payers keep saying to us, where are the diagnostic tools that are going to help us with this? Where were the diagnostics at the beginning? And my answer back to them is, you wouldn't have paid for them. And now my question, you know, to the investing community is, how are you looking at this as an opportunity, as a discrete time, hopefully a short time, but a discrete time in healthcare in the diagnostic space?
Certainly. So I think this pandemic has brought obviously a lot of attention and a lot of money into diagnostics. There's a lot of money being thrown at it. And I want to zoom out a little bit on the scale of testing that we're doing right now. Like, you know, we're now running as many tests daily to test for COVID, and as we were running of any other molecular test or all other molecular tests combined before this. So, you know, there's been tremendous shortcomings in the systems, and I think that there have been a couple of issues that have been big drivers of that. And one is not having a plan. Two is not having necessarily structured studies that help us in getting to that disease understanding that Christiana was referring to. And I think as we zoom out and we think about this as investors, we're trying to think forward to, okay, what's the plan on what's happening from a testing perspective next year? And what's the plan after that? And what are the new testing paradigms that emerge as a result of this? And I will say that there are a couple of things that have been, I think, irreversible trends that we have noticed as part of this. And one is that, you know, people appreciate, I think, now the value of a good diagnostic. And then it's also sort of revealed a bit of the absurdity of our historical system. And I say absurdity, and I played a role in developing some of these products, right? But, you know, it's a tremendous logistics web to get a sample from, you know, where it comes from to where it needs to be tested to where an action needs to be taken. And I think over the course of my career, people have been talking about point of care testing emerging, right? And I think we're going to jump right through point of care testing to at-home testing being the norm, because we're all used to dialing in from 6 different places now, right? And I'm perfectly happy to do the same thing with my doctor. And I feel perfectly empowered right now to do a nasal swab myself and run the test because I want to know the answer. And I think that that's going to be one of the more profound and lasting shifts that's going to happen over this. And it's sort of, I think, taking the logistics out of what was, you know, revealed to be an incredibly inefficient system. So I think that's one of the major macro trends. And yeah, one of the major macro trends that we're likely to emerge from this pandemic.
That's a fascinating take. And I think that that's really true. And I think that, you know, when you look at some of the data that's come out that I guess is sitting with the FDA on the paper strip testing, you sit there and you wonder, we could probably be doing this for just about everything. You know, if we can use CRISPR for that, we could probably use it for just about everything. I was on a call maybe about a month ago. I don't know if you know Ravender Kolvi, who is running the host genome variation consortium that's looking at the differences in structural DNA as they relate to being able to predict a patient ending up in the ICU. And he was describing the timeline of the consortium as being a 5-year study that they were going to take because it's all grant funded, and there was, you know, a pretty lengthy grant funding process. And, you know, do you think that investors are thinking about how to accelerate that process for that type of innovation and that type of information? And if so, you know, what do you need from the payers? What do you need to see from the regulators in order to enable that and not have all of us waiting on grant funding?
Any category that has reimbursement attracts investor interest in a way that categories without reimbursement don't. So clarity on what that is and what's acceptable and what will drive reimbursement will drive investor interest and activity. And that's where I think, you know, what you do in your day job is incredibly important. And that starts with also just a plan of what you're going to do with that information as a result of the test. So I think what Christiana was speaking to and how she would use a test, and then understanding the clinical impact that can have, those are just incredibly important. And I would urge anybody who's thinking in terms of a 5-year time cycle to figure out a way to accelerate that. I've spoken with people that the other thing I've seen emerge from this cycle is that I've seen people who spent 18 months, literally they've said, a product that I used to do in 18 months, we did in 6 weeks in this cycle. Now, I'm not going to say it's done. I'm not going to say that it's FDA approved. You know, it's EUA, and EUA is not FDA approval. I think we're all clear on that. But they got as far in 6 weeks as they would have normally gotten in 18 months. And I think that's the mentality that people need to take into accelerating that timeline as well. And that's obviously going to raise investor interest as well. Because if there's a way to get something through in the EUA process that can be sticky, 6 months for good enough and useful can be far better than 5 years and great.
For sure. Mark, I thought what Garden did by applying for an EUA in a disease in which the company does not specialize, and to my knowledge, didn't really have any background in, was incredibly interesting and really impressive. Can you describe a little bit about why Garden decided to go into COVID-19 testing when you're really essentially the leader in liquid biopsy for cancer?
That's right. Of course, I'm with Garden Health, and it's known for its work in precision oncology. That is, in ascertaining those genomic drivers of any solid tumor. And so we had developed, through next generation sequencing, a means through a simple blood draw to make that determination, that diagnosis. And so it's a completely different field. It's certainly, within the ballpark of diagnosis, but within the, a completely part of that stadium with respect to entering this new realm of infectious disease. And I think it was really, our decision was really somewhat analogous maybe to the decision of the United States in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor with the Manhattan Project, to see that there was a great enthusiasm and a great urgency, as has been described about the effort at that time to develop the first nuclear weapons to fight that war. And I think we really perceived that we were in this pandemic, and there was this great need, that we had a very real enemy, and that concurrent with this need, there was this great deficiency in terms of our country's capacity to test. And so with those two characteristics of enthusiasm and urgency, our company quickly embarked upon this new trailblazing effort to do something we had never done before. But we knew, we had confidence that we really had three things. We had the minds, we had the machinery, and we had the methods. And so in Manhattan Project fashion, we embarked upon this monumental effort to exploit these three to come up with, indeed, a COVID-19 test, for which, as you alluded, Hannah has received that FDA tentative approval. And we've attempted to undergo that validation to assure, for the benefit of payers like Eugene, to assure its validation, its credibility. And really this was done, I guess there's two ways that you can incentivize developers. One, of course, is through money, but there's also the secondary incentivization of a sense of social responsibility. And I think really that the latter is really the impetus that really animated our monumental effort. Of note, we're really not seeking health plan reimbursement. Rather, we're seeking to provide this test directly to those groups that need it in exchange for direct reimbursement, hopefully to cover our costs. So we're providing this really as maybe as a service to entities like universities, factories to get their employees back. For example, we're at one sausage making factory, but foremost really to provide this needed service to our own employees. And so I think it's really that sense of social responsibility that has been incentivizing us in this journey, and really has brought us a great deal of joy. I mean, we still have our day job, which is our focus of the cancer detection, but this is kind of a nice concurrent avocation to just to provide that service to our country.
Yeah, it's really impressive that Guardant took that initiative and frankly took the risk, not knowing if you're going to get FDA emergency use authorization and not knowing if you're going to be able to cover your costs is really significant. But I think, your point about making it available to companies and groups that need to have access to testing and maybe can't afford to have it, can't afford it to pay $160 for a test, which is what it is down the street from me. Andy, you work with a lot of companies and unions that have been kind of learning their diagnostic vocabulary and maybe haven't been thinking prior to February too much about PCR and antigen versus antibody testing. But a lot of companies are taking this into their own hands. I'm sure you've all seen what the NBA has done, which I think is one of the most forward-thinking groups that I have seen witness to. They realized that testing was going to be the key to them having a season, and they said, we need to get testing. They were on it in April and they started their season, and they, I think they've been a model to everyone. Andy, how much of a challenge is this for the companies that you're working with, and how are they thinking about it for their employees?
Yes, it's a major challenge, and really the goal is to make sure that they don't end up in the care of folks like Dr. Yashara and taking up the hospital beds. But there's really two big challenges. One is values and trust in everything. And then two is the persistent difficulty in understanding the ever-changing marketplace. So with values and trust, there's been a quickly decreasing trust in larger scientific bodies that usually have a lot, like the FDA and CDC. But also with the labs, they're not sure how best to trust these labs, as they know that these organizations are moving at breakneck speeds compared to their usual timelines. And we're living in a virtual world where it's hard to build that trust for several reasons. And not least of which is that this is kind of prime environment for folks that are malintentioned to make a quick buck, but also for the well-intentioned folks that can quickly get overwhelmed with demand and get in over their heads. So we've been trying to work with groups, both with the labs, but also with the organizations, in trying to build that trust as quickly as possible, and make sure that, as Dr. Hyatt mentioned, they're enthusiastic, passionate, values-driven folks, and then making sure that that quantitative data, however hard it is to compare those apples to apples, really back that up. In understanding the marketplace, for lay people like myself, it's been a learning process along the way. You know, pop science is constantly flip-flopping on what they want to focus on, and you open up whatever newspaper or Twitter or cable channel, constantly something different, and usually something very drastic and dramatic, as it tends to be when portraying scientific fact. But we're also trying to figure out how to understand some of the conflicting research that's out there in the preprint articles, some of the conflicting data that exists with the EUA versus what some third-party clinical studies have focused on, like what Cleveland Clinic is doing. And so just trying to stay ahead of the curve as much as possible and learn about it. You know, I feel like we're at a point now where most people understand what RT-PCR testing is, so much so that they name it that, even though we know that there are RT-LAMP and RT-NGS tests that are out there, CRISPR tests that are coming out, antigen and antibody tests that are coming out that can be diagnostic, but it's really hard to understand that and then incorporate that into a structure and a system that is going to provide to lower relative risk, because we're never going to get to 100% safety, but it's all about trying to lower the relative risk. So one other issue that I'll point out, and something that Eugene highlighted, was the difficulty of understanding who's paying for this, you know, from an insurance point of view, but also from a municipality point of view. Is the municipality in charge of all of the people living and or working or learning in their county? Or is it the companies? Or is it the individuals? Or is it philanthropy? These are all things that are constantly changing, and I think are going to continue to change over time. I saw a couple people on mute, so I want to back away, but we do have kind of like a 5-step method that we try to help individuals get through, that I can go into more detail. But I don't know if anybody wanted to. I'm into
individual companies get through, you mean, or? Individual
companies, but also municipalities. So I'll just run through them really quickly. So, you know, first is really deciding on which diagnostic test to utilize, which, as we've discussed, this whole panel is constantly changing and is really hard to do. And with the on-site tests, the rapid tests, those are, we've found them to be not as reliable on the PCR side, maybe just 1 or 2 of them to be reliable, like a group called Capture. And then they have to figure out, based on the audience and the test and the budget, how often they should be testing. We're really recommending doing a baseline test so that you know before anybody comes back in person that they know where they're at. Then obviously doing symptomatic and contact tracing testing, but then trying to decide, what does surveillance testing look like for your audience? That's going to change. You know, a big part of it is budget, and that is a big aspect that everyone from universities to municipalities to schools, like we're working with up at Santa Clara County, who's doing a great job at it. We're trying to figure that out along the way. And then it's the vetting piece, right? Vetting all of the different diagnostic tests that fit their particular need. You know, we've developed this spreadsheet that, for as much as we can, looks at the PPAs and the NPAs and the limit of detections. But it also, as I mentioned before, it looks at the values of the organization. That's the first cell in their row. But also we're looking at, you know, what are the genes that they're looking for? With the latest CDC assay that comes out, focusing on N4 and influenza A and influenza B, are they starting to incorporate that in? There's a lot of questions there. And we're really also looking at a key part is turnaround time. We do not recommend any lab that takes more than 48 hours to turn around the test once it arrives at the lab. And cost, we are not recommending that anybody should be paying more than $90 maximum for an RT-PCR test. It should be less than that, and at scale it should be a lot less than that. And so we are in a referral space where we refer the groups and then we step away, and we let the companies and the municipalities and the diagnostic lab talk it out. But then the last 2 things to focus on are sample collection and then the scheduling or response software. The sample collection previously, earlier this summer, was really difficult because of the heat and outside, and then having to do NP swabs and who is qualified to do NP swabs, and it's a cost that these organizations may not have put together. Oh, I need to pay for XYZ number of nurses to be out there collecting NP swabs. And then what happened over the summer, what's happening now in these natural disasters, and then what's going to happen in the winter, is that makes it harder and harder to do these tests outside in a safe environment. And so as we bring it inside, how do we make that as safe as possible, knowing that ventilation is an issue, all these other things. And then scheduling and response software. As Parker mentioned, the labs are moving quickly, and there is oftentimes the labs don't have the scheduling side of things because we're doing more diagnostic testing than we've ever done before, but they also don't have the response mechanisms. So we're seeing a massive gap in the scheduling piece, knowing capacity of the labs, but also for the individuals, the ease of the UX and UI to know how to just click through to get to your scheduled time. And then the importance of response time. So built on the turnaround time, how quickly can the individual patient and the organization know what is happening? And as many people might have heard, Helpvana is one of the leaders in that. We've had great experience in recommending them to folks. And overall, this is for companies and municipalities that have willing employees and people that live and work there. There are many other steps and discussions that we need to be having around employees and citizens that may not want to do that. I would recommend some sort of restorative justice movement of how to think through how to educate folks instead of using just a carrot or a stick, trying to figure out what's in the middle there. But also COVID has, affected the vulnerable populations of this country more so than anybody else. And so how do we reach the communities of color, the low-income communities where it's further away from labs, it's harder to transport testing there, and there's just a larger lack of trust in government. And I think there's a real importance, and there's some really great counties that are doing this well. Tacoma County in Washington is particularly doing this well, where they've built previously really strong grassroots partnerships with these rural, tribal communities of color, and are paying them, often to the local trusted nonprofits, small ones, to ensure adoption. And this goes into what you mentioned around the NBA as well, right? They created a bubble, which is another reason why they were really successful. Mm-hmm. But how do diagnostic testing match with mask wearing, with physical distancing, with all the rest of the things that will help lower relative risk in this?
Sure. Well, and I think I'd like Eugene to answer the question about who pays for it. But I mean, I think it also goes to Parker's point about the at-home testing, because if it's something that you can bring at home and control the process yourself and get the information yourself, it does start to engender a certain amount of trust that maybe if you don't have a place that you can go, if you start to have access, we have to get to a cost of goods and a price for the test that's reasonable. And I mean, you could argue that since we're in a public health crisis, some of that should be free, but question is who pays for that? Eugene?
Right. So I knew this was going to come back. So I have a number of things, and that was terrific. It's good to hear everybody's perspective, and so want to try to tie this together, right? And great points, and those that 5 points that you discussed, Andy, some folks will say it's common sense, right? But it's brilliant. It's of how to go about doing it. And a lot of them is something that, in my daily work, in our daily work, we use as well. You brought up the NPA, PPA values, and actually trying to tie that back to the purpose of it. And so that's where I'm going to start. And there's a couple of points that Parker brought up that I would like to incorporate as well. So let me start by addressing what you asked, Hannah, as far as the payment is concerned. So as this whole situation was evolving, we had to categorize, right? So what is medically necessary? What is considered surveillance? What is a public health issue versus an individual issue? What is considered routine testing in scope of our contracts with, let's say, hospitals? So we had to categorize all that. What is considered screening? How good are the antibody tests? Which ones are good enough? I think Andy brought up that point too. That you can't put everything in the same bucket just because they're under a certain category of tests. And then, of course, the lack of payment models that are out there had to be taken into account too. And I would like to bring in the panel testing into this as well. As you know, there's a number of panel tests that have come out, and they're going to continue to come out too. So to go back to the question itself regarding surveillance and screening, the definitions that have been developed by, I understand that there's a lot of back and forth, and the trust component that Andy brought up is eroding. I hope they're able to get it back, because these are things that we have looked up to, such as CDC and other institutions that bring it up. But using those definitions of what they consider surveillance and screening is what we have been using. And the current sort of distinction that we make is individual testing for a medically necessary scenario versus screening and surveillance, which are going to be done for overall public health perspective. And of course, as we know that there is resources and funding that is available for that. Even CDC, I don't know where they are in the development of that particular test that they were going to use exclusively for surveillance purposes. So the best answer that I can provide is the distinction that is being made across the board, which I believe is necessary, of what is considered surveillance and or screening versus individual patient management, which is going to be impacted through the results of that test that are going to be there. So following, things that we can recite off the top of our head. Are they presenting with symptoms? Are they presenting with, are they not presenting with symptoms, but they're asymptomatic, but they had exposure? Now, obviously, we're not going to be putting in criteria what CDC is saying, well, 50 minutes of exposure or not. What we're leaving it up to is the docs that we have on this panel as well, is their determination. They're the ones who are going to evaluate each particular individual. And if they believe that they need a certain type of testing, that is our criteria. They are the ones who are going to be driving this particular thing. Now, obviously, if in today's world, if somebody's trying to use antibody for diagnostic purposes, that is not going to be a covered service. But if they, but the healthcare provider and the patient interaction and the patient providing the particular history and healthcare provider assessing this is going to be driving that particular decision of making it into an individual patient management versus surveillance and screening. And that is sort of what our criteria looks like at this point, which is not misaligned with a lot of the guidelines that are out there. You have to remember, we have to put all of the guidelines, which are being based on ever-changing evidence and data, and everybody's in this together, but we're dealing with a lot of unknowns. So we have to aggregate all of that data, aggregate all of those guidelines, and find common themes and factors there, and see how they pitch up against our way of doing things. So one thing that is being brought up is, let's say somebody's coming in for surgery, right? And they want to do, obviously they need to do COVID-19 testing on them. Now we have to go towards something non-scientific in that particular manner and look at the contracts. How are the DRG payments set up? Is it a bundle payment that is already out there that they will be doing other type of testing, and this is an additional piece there? So that's the non-science part of it. But when it comes to science and data-driven thing, the distinctions are being made between surveillance and or screening and individual patient management, and I gave you a couple of criteria that will be used. But the healthcare provider will be at the center of all of this, right? So I think we cannot ignore that particular aspect, because there's, among all the unknowns, there's certain known things that we have. There's going to be an overlap. For example, there's going to be an overlap between other respiratory illnesses, other illnesses stemming from respiratory pathogens, and this particular one that we're learning about, right? COVID-19. So if a panel is presenting from a testing perspective where you have RCV, different types of influenza, and COVID-19, we're not putting any restrictions on that. Those are covered. If they have an EUA, they have okay data. It's not that somebody's trying to game the system. We have removed capitation requirements, network requirements, and there's a certain way I look at panel testing, as you know, right? But in this particular environment, that's if a provider believes that for differential diagnosis that is needed, it's going to be covered, right? But that is separate from surveillance and screening, where you have basically you're dividing up populations and making decisions accordingly. And one quick point from what Parker was saying, I would second that, is as far as, yes, timelines can be condensed. We're seeing that, but that data, which speaking from a future state, when this is going to be, there's going to be prognostic markers that come out, and also a therapeutic related sort of, we can even imagine a companion diagnostic word for this, that are coming out. Data cannot be missing from those particular areas, right? So the time can be condensed. As a group, as multiple stakeholders, we have to realize that we are able to do this in shorter times, but at the same time, develop those standards and parameters of what we're going to be asking from an evidentiary base, right? So in order, like I said previously, that connection, that if you do this, if you have this particular biological marker or these couple of markers, this is how you're going to go about it, and we're going to base all of our patient treatment and on this, or patient management on this. That particular piece, we all know how to develop that data. We have been doing it for decades. That is out there. Now we have realized that that can be done quickly. There can be more collaboration that can be put in place. So we just have to make sure that using those epidemiological principles, those study design principles, which everybody is I wouldn't say struggling with, because we know what N of 1 trials look like. We knew how FDA was dealing with our, rare diseases, or for instance, I don't want to bring in gene therapy, but how are they going about doing those approvals? Lessons learned from over time can be implemented because of the situation we're dealing with. You will have less resistance from, let's say, reimbursement companies when you're bringing up the fact, hey, look, we're dealing with a public health emergency. Tell us how to work through this. So I just want to make sure, something that Parker brought up, that the lessons learned from previously can be employed, and this may be the environment where we do this. But certain things we have to keep in mind is that, yes, you can be innovative in looking at principles, but those principles cannot be ignored of how to reach a decision and establish routine clinical care that is going to be determined by diagnostic, prognostics, or even let's see if there's companion diagnostics that come about as we learn more and more about this situation we're dealing with.
Yeah, we're just about out of time, but I think the important point there to follow up between Andy and Eugene is that if we are assuming that the only tests that are going to be paid for by payers are the ones that definitively diagnose COVID, then we're going to be stuck with the bill and having to figure out who is going to be paying for the critical surveillance testing that is going to be key to controlling the pandemic. And similarly, if we don't have the tools to assess risk, we're going to see disproportionate effects in certain populations that are seeing more severity from COVID. And we need to figure out a way to get those tools onto the market and get them paid for in a way that accelerates their development. Thank you all so much for joining the panel today. If you can all hold on, we're going to move on to the next section, which is question and answer from the audience members. Hi, everyone. We're back. I hope you enjoyed that session discussing COVID diagnostics and what the opportunities for improving our pandemic situation are. We have a few questions from the audience today. The first one is to you, Parker. There are several questions coming in, and I think it's a popular discussion right now, the differences between antigen testing and PCR testing, and really a focus on, I'm sure you've seen what Dr. Michael Mina from the Harvard School of Public Health has been advocating for, which is more frequent at-home antigen testing and putting an emphasis on getting those type of tests in the hands of homes, people, schools, workplaces, in order to really get a lay of the land of where we are with COVID spread and to allow people to test on a very regular basis. What are your thoughts on that juxtaposed with the need to continue doing PCR testing?
Thanks. Thanks for the question. And I think first and foremost, what we need is a higher volume of testing that's run on a routine basis, and that the results are returned in a timely manner. And when you look at those practical matters and you think about rolling this out on a screening basis, which is really the gap for controlling the spread. And the reason that screening is critically important is because 40% of patients who have COVID don't know they have it. So if you're not screening, it doesn't matter how good your test is, you're missing 40% of people. When you roll those things together, when you say it's got to happen frequently, it's got to happen with a quick turnaround time, what's really being advocated there is that antigens are good enough if you run them routinely to catch a lot of that spread. Now, PCR is more sensitive than antigens, no question. And I want to come back to the point that Christiana raised as she was describing this disease. We're still learning, right? We're still learning what level of viral titer is actually infectious. We're still learning what the viral titer is over the course of disease between symptomatic and asymptomatic, how that's different between a nasopharyngeal and a nasal and a saliva sample. And the truth of the matter is, when you need more testing than we have ever done in any other category before, you kind of get down to the practical issues of what can we roll out at scale. And antigen tests are the thing that you can roll out at the highest scale. You just can't scale PCR tests to tens of millions a day. So they're a great tool. You have to know how to use them. You have to be ready to reflex the 0.5% or the 1% or the 1.5% that are false positives. You have to be ready to reflex all those positives to PCR to get to a definitive result. But it's a tool that's needed because it's a tool that can scale and address the the magnitude of the issue that we're facing.
What do you think about the other question in terms of the sample type? For those of us who've been tested and have had the brain tickling of the nose swab up the nasal cavity, it is not something that inspires you to want to go get a frequent COVID test if you don't need one.
Yep.
What are your thoughts on some of the spit tests, some of the easier nasal tests in terms of if there's any compromise in sensitivity, and how does that make for a trade-off for, as you said, access and frequency of use?
So I think there is a compromise in sensitivity. I also don't think it matters because the samples that you lose when you look at the gap between the performance of nasopharyngeal and nasal swabs tend to be the ones that are below 10,000 copies per ml. And I haven't found anybody who would argue that somebody below 10,000 copies per ml is infectious. And that includes a lot of our different calls that we've made with physicians and pathology groups. And we make an argument for this routine screening at scale in our map that we post at RA Capital or racap.com. Frequent testing is what's needed. And if you're gonna don PPE and have to have it administered by a healthcare worker, you're killing your throughput and you're digging yourself a bigger hole. It's just not a practical solution, and it's overkill.
Great. Well, we only had 5 minutes for question and answer today for this session. So thank you again to everyone listening in at home or your office. And thank you especially to all my panelists who joined me today. And thank you to the Precision Medicine Leadership Summit group.